Welcome to Understanding Perspectives with Paul Mussel. Today I'm going to be talking about 5 perspectives of divine foreknowledge. I'm going to try my best to give you an objective rundown of the spectrum of ideas, what various people have thought throughout history about this subject of divine foreknowledge. What is it exactly, and does God have it, and if so, in what way? There are 3 ideas that are related to this that I want to incorporate into this discussion: omniscience, whether or not future possibilities are real, and human freedom. Do we have the power of alternate choice? You can see this table that shows how these ideas are related to these various different perspectives. I want to start by explaining what divine determinism is, because I think it's the easiest concept to understand, and it'll help you see how these other ideas are related. Okay, so people who believe in divine determinism, they think that God has determined all things. So back before creation, in the eternal past, God, according to their way of thinking, made a decree that included everything that would ever happen, everything that would ever come into existence, and everything that would happen to it. And so the whole future was always, from the beginning of creation, fixed, in that there was one decree that God made and one path forward that we're just kind of living out and waiting to see what happens, because the future is out there in a real sense, and not necessarily that it exists already. That's a different question, but that it's definite that it's going to be a particular way. And so the way that it got that way from this divine determinism perspective is that God wanted it to be that way, and because he's all powerful, he decided it was going to be like that. And so this relates to divine foreknowledge, in that God's foreknowledge is exhaustively definite. In every respect, it's certain and definite. There's no such thing in this way of thinking as a future possibility. So there's no choices that can be made between alternatives at this point for anyone, even God, because he's already decided how it's going to be. So everything is set in stone about what's going to happen. It doesn't seem that way to us, but that's how these people believe that it's going to go. And so in their view, omniscience is an absolute. God knows everything, and with certainty and definiteness. There's no ifs and maybes. Those are just not part of reality. And as far as the future possibilities being real, absolutely not. There is no way that there is a choice for anyone to make about what's going to happen. That has already been decided. So we may contemplate things, we may deliberate between alternatives that seem real to us, but from this perspective, those are just illusory. We will do whatever it is that God has predestined for us to do. And how does this relate to human freedom? This is probably the part of this conversation that most people seem to be preoccupied with the most. I do think it's an important piece, but from my perspective, it's not the central piece. But there's an important division here. You'll notice on the table that on the 3rd row, the human freedom, power of alternate choice, that the divine determinist is different than everybody else, in that they say, no, people are not free in the sense that they have the ability to choose between alternatives. And a lot of people are offended by this idea. They think that it's core to who we are, and that it's an important thing for God and even human judges to be able to judge justly, that there needs to have been an alternative for the guilty person to have done otherwise. It's just, that's kind of what people intuitively think, is that freedom just is the ability to choose between alternatives. The divine determinist says, no, that is not what human freedom is. Human freedom is the ability to do what you want. So from their perspective, God does not force people to do things against their will. It's not like they don't want to sin and God just drags them by the ear and makes them do it. God does not work that way from their perspective. What actually happens is that his decree includes all things, and we will freely choose to do exactly what God decreed that we would do, by virtue of the fact that we want to do exactly what he decreed that we would do. And so we are not having our will compromised. It's free to do exactly what it wants. That's how they think about this. And yet, it is this sort of freedom, they say, is compatible with responsibility, uh, moral responsibility. So even though people had no alternative but to do whatever sins that they did, and they don't get to really decide whether they're going to be saved or not, that's up to God. That part's already written. Every part's already written from their perspective. So they say that even still, God is just. It's His universe. He has creator's rights, some people might say, and so He can do with creation whatever He wants. And so He does want to control everything, and He wants to hold people responsible for the choices that they make, even though they had no alternative, because they freely did whatever they did, whether it's good or bad. Okay, so everybody else says no. Everybody says yes, that people have the power of alternate choice, that they have freedom in the libertarian sense, not in the compatibilist sense. So the divine determinist says it's compatible for people to be morally accountable, morally guilty for whatever they've done wrong, and not free to do anything different. And everybody else says no, in order to be morally accountable for what you've done, you had to have the power to do otherwise. And so this is what they call libertarian freedom, which is the ability to choose between alternatives. So the process theologian and the open theist, they both say yes, absolutely, people can and do have the power to choose between real alternatives. And they are real alternatives, because if on the second row here you'll see, they affirm that future possibilities are real. So from their perspective, the future is unwritten in many respects. And it is, in a sense, waiting for us, for the free agents who have this libertarian freedom, to resolve these possibilities into actualities. And so until that happens, or until something about who we are, if our character is solidified enough in a particular direction so that it's knowable that people will act in a particular way, then at that time, maybe days, weeks, hours, months, or even years prior to an event, it could become certain that something would happen in a particular way, but much of the future is unsettled in their view. And so this power of alternate choice is actually real. For these two other groups that are kind of in the middle, simple and middle foreknowledge, they both want to say that future possibilities are not real. It's absolutely the case in both of these perspectives that the future is settled in every respect. And the reason that they think that it's settled is not that God has decreed that it will be settled, but for a little bit more complicated reasons that are different between these, they think that part of what it means for God to be omniscient is that He knows all things. And that all things that He knows is that all the things that God knows, He knows as definite from their perspective. They don't think that He knows things as possibilities. And so because they think that to say that God knows it's possible for this to happen, but it's also possible for that to happen, would be equivalent to saying, well, this is just something that God doesn't know. And so because they assume that part of what it means to be omniscient is that God knows everything as definite rather than possible, then they assume that the future is therefore fixed. And so, because it must be fixed if God knows it is fixed, even if it doesn't seem like that to us, and even if we talk like there's possibilities, we might do this, we might do that, and we're contemplating between alternatives, researching different products to see which one we're going to buy, from their perspective, it's already definite that what we are going to do, that's a fact that's out there that God knows. We don't know the fact, but God knows the fact. And so it only seems to us like we have the power to choose between alternatives. And they would, depending on which one you say here, they, depending on the simple or middle foreknowledge, they'll give a slightly different account of how that they could say that people have the power of alternate choice. But they do say that. But they don't actually affirm that it's possible for somebody to make a different choice than God knew they were going to make. Okay, so there's an inconsistency there in these kind of middle two about what they say and what they really mean by it. And this is something that they get criticized for a lot from people at both ends of the spectrum. So like on the divine determinists, they say, okay, look, God is more glorious because He's the one that has established the fact of the future, and it makes sense that He could do that because He's God, but for Him to just look down the corridors of time and see what's going to happen, and that His knowledge of who's going to be saved or what's going to happen is based on somebody outside of himself, then they would just see that as deficiency in God, and so they would criticize this as an incoherent idea. On the other side of the spectrum, the process theologians and the open theists, they would actually agree and say, okay, this doesn't make sense, that you shouldn't be able to affirm both, that people have the power to choose between alternatives and deny that there are alternatives. And so they think that the mistake is to think that the future is settled in every respect. And so they think, the open theists and the process theologian both think that the future is unwritten, and so God knows that whatever aspects of the future that are unsettled as unsettled. And it's not a deficiency in his knowledge from their perspective to say that God doesn't know these things, because there's nothing there for him to know. It's not like it's a reality that exists yet, and there are no facts out there to be known about it. And so they don't deny omniscience. Some of them may, especially the process theology guys, they might say that God doesn't have omniscience about the future, whereas most of the open theists, I think, are going to say, yeah, God knows what the content of the future is. He knows what all the possibilities are, the full range of whatever they are. But the fact of which one is going to become definite has not been established. And so, of course, God is not going to believe something false about the future. He's not going to believe that the future is definite if, in fact, it's possible, right? So, as an example, they might say, God does not know that there is a unicorn sitting in my lap right now, precisely because there's not. He doesn't know that it's there, but that's not a defect in his knowledge. His knowledge is accurate about the situation. There is no unicorn sitting in my lap, and so he doesn't know that there is one, because there isn't. And so, in the same way, God would not know that the future is definite if, in fact, it isn't. If it's still possible that it could go a different way, then God would know that it's possible that it could go a different way. And so, that's what the process theology and open theist guys would say. Okay, now, let's talk about the difference between simple foreknowledge and middle foreknowledge. Okay, both of these guys want to say, or both these groups want to say, God's omniscient, he knows everything, the future's settled, there is no such thing as a future possibility, but they both want to affirm that humans have, and maybe angels and even animals have, libertarian freedom, the power to choose between alternatives, even though they can't actually choose something different than they were going to choose, because God already knows what they're going to choose. So it's actually settled, but they theoretically could choose, but the fact of what they will choose is out there on some basis, and the basis on which that it's out there is different between these. And this is a kind of a fine distinction, but it's an important one for some of these guys to make, depending on what their perspective is. So the simple foreknowledge guys, there's a book, Divine Foreknowledge, 4 Views, and it doesn't have anybody that's representing the process theology, but they basically take these other 4 views, and David Hunt, he offers a bunch of different possible explanations for how you might give an account for simple foreknowledge. And to me, it seemed like he proposed that you could say this, but almost every single one of them, it was like, that probably wouldn't work. And so it's probably not that. But what I understand, that's kind of how I read him. But he seemed to like this divine timelessness idea that God's outside of time. And so it's kind of like he's looking at a parade from far away, and he can see what every part of the parade is doing, and that the parade is analogous to time. And so God is seeing like all of time, past, present, and future, as like a fixed block of data. And so he could just look at a different point along that line and see what it's like and what's going on. And so because he has the ability to do that, then he knows what everybody's going to choose, even though what's real is that people can make these choices that are free in a libertarian sense, and so that he could hold them morally responsible for what they do and bring judgment justly, even though they can't do anything different than what they were always going to do. But the fact of what they were always going to do is, in this perspective, rooted in the choice of the person. And how it works exactly, a lot of people appeal to this timeless idea, divine timelessness, but most of them are just appeal to either, they might explain it like that, but they'll say, well, it's just too big of a mystery, we can't understand it. And I actually respect this, because even though it's got some mutually contradictory claims built in, they have these claims because they see in Scripture reasons to, what they think as reasons to hold all these things, even though that some of them are incompatible logically with the other ones. And they're just attributed to a mystery, like so many other things that people do, attribute to mysteries. The middle foreknowledge group, the Molenists as they're often known, they have a different view in that this is more of a, it's not a, it's a logical, not a temporal difference that they make, because they both want to say that God knew from the eternal past that the fact of all things that were going to be in the future. But the middle foreknowledge, they have this idea of counterfactuals. Counterfactuals are what would have been true in a different situation. It's not true right now, but had things been different, then it would have been true. And so there's the realm of counterfactuals that, from their perspective, is way bigger than the realm of what's actually true and what's actually real. Because they have this idea that there was a set of possible worlds that God could have created, and that he chose the one that he decided was best and created that one. And in all these possible worlds, there were apparently lots of them that God could have created with people who had libertarian freedom, and maybe ones that had compatibilist freedom too, but that's not the kind that they say God created, because they believe in libertarian freedom. And so they think that God chose from among these possible worlds and actualized one, and then that's what we're living in, and that this is apparently the best of all possible worlds, or best of all possible paths to the best of all possible worlds. Maybe that's a better way to put it. The open theists, some people think kind of along those lines, in that they think that God created the world that had the best opportunity to, or the best possibility to become the best possible world, but that the definiteness is not built into it, that the freedom that people have is real, and that the possibilities that in the future are real, and that there were possibilities in what used to be the future, but it was now the past, and that have been now resolved. And so some people would call an open theist a neo-Molenist. But in any case, both of those views, are kind of stuck with this. If the open theist takes this neo-Molenist slant, they're both stuck with this fact of, or this enormous set of facts of what might have happened if God had created a different kind of world, and that this set of data is somehow eternally independent of God. And so that's a criticism that opponents to Molinism would offer. Okay, in process theology, it's a lot like open theism. They believe that the future is full of possibilities, and that people have libertarian freedom, and they're a little bit, I think at least, and I know the least about process theology of all these things I've been talking about, but I think that they're the group that's most likely to deny that God is omniscient. And there's this idea that they have about how that there's a reality in the relationship between reality and God's perception of reality, and that the perception of it actually alters what is actually real, and that one affects the other, and that there's this kind of interplay, and it's like all of reality in their perspective is a process, and is not best represented by conceptually as sets of facts, but as a process that's changing all the time. And so it's very much on the opposite end of the spectrum from this divine determinism thing, because they also have a very different sort of idea about what it is like for God to be God. Whereas the divine determinists have these timeless, immutable, impassible, sort of very fixed sort of ideas about what God is like. And the process theology end, God is a process just like reality, and he's in constant change all the time as his experience of the world changes. And so it doesn't mean necessarily they would say that he changes in his essence, or what he's in his nature or something like that. That's not what I'm saying, but they have a very different idea about God than a lot of people on this spectrum. And so I don't have a lot to say about process theology, because I don't understand it that much, to be honest with you. There's a lot of philosophy in it, and it seems like a lot of process theology people are smart. I think you have to be able to understand what they're even talking about. And there's not a lot of them out there, and when I have heard them talk, maybe I'm not smart enough to understand what they're talking about, but I'd like to get one or more of them on the show and get them to explain to you what they think and why they think it. So that's pretty much what I know about these different perspectives as far as just how they're distinguished from each other. And you can see on the table, there's different people who are advocates of these different positions, and that there are, if you look in the denominations row, you'll see that there's a lot of diversity among denominations, in that you would have people probably of most of these different perspectives that would attend churches of lots of different kind of churches. And so you'd have a mix, but there's a few denominations that are very much on the divine determinism side. You know, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Catholics, they're all on that end of the spectrum. So it doesn't mean everybody that goes to those churches has that same theology, but at the top, it is kind of that way. So I'm going to try and get some more people to, I'm trying to get some people to interview about this subject and to get their perspective and why they think it. And I'm also going to try and do some other videos, maybe on the individual ones of these, and trying to see from Scripture what the reasons are that people see in Scripture to adhere to one of these perspectives or another, and why they have problems with each other. So tune back in for those episodes. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this has been helpful. God bless you.